The snowflakes fell like frozen tears from a charcoal sky, and Richard Calloway, worth more than most people could earn in 10 lifetimes, sat motionless in the back of his black, luxury sedan, staring at a woman he'd never met, but somehow couldn't ignore. She was huddled at the bus stop, her thin scrubs barely visible beneath a worn jacket, her shoulders trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard felt something crack inside the ice around his heart. "Sir, the light is green," his driver murmured. But Richard raised one hand, his eyes never leaving the young woman whose face fell exhausted, streaked with something that looked like dried tears, reminded him painfully of someone he'd lost. "Pull over," he said quietly, and though his driver hesitated, the car eased to the curb, and Richard stepped out into the biting December wind, his $1,000 coat doing little to shield him from the cold that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the weather. The woman didn't notice him at first. She was staring at the empty road with hollow eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too many endings and not enough hope. And when Richard approached, she flinched slightly, her hand instinctively moving to the strap of her worn nursing bag. "I'm sorry to startle you," Richard said, his voice softer than he'd used in years of boardroom negotiations. "But I noticed you've been waiting here for some time, and the buses, they stopped running 20 minutes ago due to the storm." She looked up at him then, and he saw she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30 at most, with dark circles under her green eyes and a name tag that read MRN clipped to her scrubs. "I know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't know where else to go." The vulnerability in those words hit Richard like a physical blow, and before his logical mind could intervene, his heart spoke. "You're coming with me." Emma's eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. No, I can't. I don't even know you. I'll be fine. I just need to." But her words dissolved into a violent shiver, and Richard noticed for the first time that her lips had a faint blue tinge. "Please," he said, and the desperation in his own voice surprised him. This isn't anything improper. I just can't leave you here to freeze. My daughter, she was." He stopped, the words catching. "Just please, let me help you get warm and safe, and then I'll take you wherever you need to go." Something in his brokenness must have reached through her fear, because after a long moment, Emma nodded, and Richard guided her gently to the car, wrapping his own coat around her shoulders, despite her protests. Inside the vehicle, as warmth flooded over them and Emma's shivering slowly subsided, Richard instructed his driver to take them to his estate, and he saw Emma's panic begin to rise again, until he quickly added, "You can stay in the guest house. It's completely separate, with locks, and my housekeeper Mrs. Chen is there. She'll get you warm clothes, food, whatever you need, and in the morning, I'll personally ensure you get home safely. You have my word." Emma studied his face in the dim light of the car, searching for deception and finding only a deep, old sadness that mirrored something in her own soul. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the heater's hum. Richard was quiet for a long time, watching the snow paint the windows white. 3 years ago, he finally said, "My daughter Sophie died. She was 16. She had a rare heart condition, and she spent the last 6 months of her life in hospitals, cared for by nurses who showed her more kindness than I." His voice cracked. "Than I had shown her in all the years before that. I was always working, always building empires, always too busy for dance recitals and birthday dinners, and when she was dying, she asked me to promise her something." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, unashamed of the tears. "She asked me to be kinder, to see people, really see them, to help when I could, because she said the nurses who helped her, they were angels who were often invisible to people like me, people with power and money who walk past suffering every day." Emma's own eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, touching his hand gently. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I lost someone too. My little brother. He was only 12. 6 months ago, he had leukemia. I was his nurse. I quit my job at the corporate hospital to care for him full time. I spent everything I had on treatments and specialists. And when he died, I had nothing left. No job. No savings. I was evicted yesterday. I've been living in my car, but it broke down this morning. And I just finished a double shift at the emergency clinic, trying to earn enough for a deposit on a room. But the bus never came, and I just sat there thinking maybe it would be easier to just disappear into the cold. The confession hung between them, heavy and sacred, and Richard felt the shield he'd built around his heart shattered completely. When they arrived at the Calloway estate, Emma gasped. Despite herself, the mansion glowed like a palace in the snow, all warm lights and towering windows, surrounded by perfectly manicured grounds that looked like a winter wonderland. But Richard barely glanced at it, leading her instead to a beautiful cottage-style guest house that was larger than any apartment Emma had ever lived in. Mrs. Chen, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, appeared immediately, her face showing no judgment, only concern. As Richard quietly explained the situation, "Get her warm, fed, and safe," he instructed gently, "and anything she needs, anything at all." Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Stayed not because she had nowhere to go, though that was true, but because Richard asked her to, and in asking, revealed a loneliness that matched her own. He offered her a proposition. Stay in the guest house, recover, heal, and in exchange, help him with a project he'd been avoiding for 3 years, sorting through Sophie's belongings, her room that he'd kept locked and untouched, like a shrine to his guilt. Emma agreed, perhaps because she understood the paralysis of grief, or perhaps because she saw in Richard's haunted eyes a reflection of her own need for redemption. They began slowly, spending just an hour each day in Sophie's room, a teenager's paradise frozen in time, filled with dance, trophies, photographs, journals, and dreams that would never be realized. Richard would hold up a Yatoma book, a stuffed animal, a trophy, and Emma would listen as he told the story, or more often, admitted he didn't know the story. Didn't know his daughter had loved astronomy or wanted to visit Paris or had written poetry. "She wrote this," Richard said one afternoon, his hands shaking as he held a journal. "Dad works so hard to give me everything, but all I want is him." And he collapsed into sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. And Emma sat beside him, her own tears falling, holding his hand the way she'd held her brother's hand, understanding that some pain is too big to carry alone. As the days turned into weeks, Richard and Emma's relationship deepened into something neither had expected, not romance, but something perhaps more profound, a friendship forged in the fire of shared grief, a mutual rescue mission where the saved and the savior were impossible to distinguish. Richard learned that Emma had been a brilliant nurse, had turned down prestigious positions to care for her brother, and had sacrificed everything without hesitation or regret. "Do you resent it?" he asked one evening as they sat in his study, the fireplace crackling, 2 mugs of hot chocolate between them, a detail Emma had mentioned her brother loved, and which Richard now insisted Mrs. Chen make every evening. "Resent what?" Emma asked, looking up from Sophie's photo album. "Giving up everything, your career, your savings, your life, for someone you knew you might lose," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own regrets. Emma was quiet, her fingers tracing a photo of a young girl in a ballet costume. "Not for a single second," she finally said, "because those 6 months, I was fully present. I was there for every moment, every laugh, every tear, every story, every silence, and when he took his last breath. He wasn't scared because I was holding him, and he knew, without any doubt, that he was loved, that he mattered more than anything in the world to someone. And isn't that all any of us really want?" Her words hung in the air, and Richard felt them like a knife and a healing balm simultaneously, because they illuminated both his greatest failure and the path forward he'd been unable to see. "Sophie died while I was on a conference call," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I was in the hospital. They told me it could happen any time, but I took the call anyway. It was just supposed to be 5 minutes. And when I came back into her room, she was gone. And the last thing she heard from her father was me discussing quarterly earnings through a closed door. And I will never, ever forgive myself for that." Emma moved beside him, and in a gesture that surprised them both, she put her arms around him. This powerful man who commanded corporations, but couldn't command the demons of his past. "She knew you loved her," Emma said firmly. "Grief and guilt make us remember the worst and forget the rest. But Richard, she asked you to be kinder, to help others. That means she knew your heart. She knew you were capable of exactly what you did for me. A complete stranger freezing at a bus stop. You stopped, you saw me, you saved me. And you're doing it because of her, because of the love you had for her. And that love, that's what she remembered, not the missed moments, but the love that was always there, even when you were too lost to show it properly." The turning point came on a frozen January morning when Richard asked Emma to accompany him somewhere he'd never taken anyone. They drove in silence to a snow-covered cemetery, walking between rows of headstones until they reached a beautiful marble marker engraved with Sophie Marie Calloway dancing with angels now. Richard stood there, his shoulders shaking, and Emma stood beside him, her own grief surfacing as she thought of her brother's grave across town, which she hadn't visited since the funeral, because the pain was too immense. "I talk to her sometimes," Richard admitted, "but I don't know if she can hear me, or if she'd even want to listen. I failed her so completely." Emma took his hand, her voice strong despite her tears. "Then let's talk to her together," she said, and she began to speak, addressing the headstone as if Sophie were standing there. "Hi Sophie, I'm Emma. I never met you, but I know you must have been extraordinary because you changed your father's life. And in changing his, you saved mine. I was ready to give up, to let the cold take me, but he stopped. He saw me, he helped me, and he did it because of a promise he made to you, because you taught him to be kind, to notice the invisible people. And Sophie, I want you to know something. Your dad, he talks about you every day. He's been going through your room, learning all the things he missed, reading your poetry, looking at your drawings, and I see his face when he discovers something new about you. And it's full of love, such overwhelming love. And yes, he has regrets. We all do. But sweetie, he loved you. He loves you still, and he's trying so hard to honor you, to be the man you believed he could be, and I think you'd be really proud of him." Richard was sobbing openly now, and Emma continued, "And Sophie, I lost someone too, my little brother, and like your dad, I have guilt. I wonder if I did enough, if I fought hard enough, if I should have tried one more treatment, one more specialist, and the grief. It makes us forget the beautiful parts, and remember only the endings. But you asked your dad to help people, and he's helped me, and together, we're going to help others. In your name, and in my brother's name, because that's how love continues, not in the staying, but in the giving forward." And as she spoke these words, she felt them heal something inside herself, a realization crystallizing that her brother's death didn't have to be a period, but could be a comma in a longer story of meaning and purpose. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Emma began to transform their shared grief into something powerful and life-giving. Richard, with Emma's guidance and medical expertise, established the Sophie Calloway Foundation, dedicated to providing financial support, housing, and counseling for family members who left their jobs to become full-time caregivers for terminally ill loved ones. People like Emma, who sacrificed everything and were left with nothing but medical bills and heartbreak. Emma became the foundation's director, pouring her experience and passion into creating programs that addressed not just financial needs, but emotional ones. Support groups, art therapy, memory-making services, and end-of-life doulas, who ensured no one died alone or afraid. Richard threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once reserved for building his business empire. But now, his motivation was different. Each family he helped, each caregiver they supported, each child who got more time with a present parent, it was a small redemption, a tiny repayment of the debt he felt he owed to Sophie's memory. One spring morning, as they prepared for the foundation's official launch, Emma found Richard standing in what had been Sophie's room, now converted into a beautiful memorial library where families could come and find resources, comfort, and community. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing the tears on his cheeks. He turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something besides sadness in his eyes. She saw peace, tentative and fragile, but real. "I was just thinking," he said quietly, "about that night I found you at the bus stop, how close I came to just driving past, telling my driver to keep going, how easy it would have been to stay comfortable in my isolation and grief, but something made me stop, and I think it was Sophie. I really do. I think she sent me to you, or you to me, because we needed each other, because alone we were drowning, but together we could swim. And Emma, I want you to know that you didn't just let me help you, you saved my life. You gave me purpose again. You showed me that it's not too late to become the person your loved ones believed you could be." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she smiled through them. "You saved mine too," she whispered. "I had given up. Not just on that bus stop bench, but long before. I thought losing my brother meant my life was over, that I'd used up all my purpose in those 6 months of caregiving. But you showed me that love doesn't end. It transforms. It multiplies. It becomes something bigger than our individual stories." The foundation's launch was held on what would have been Sophie's 19th birthday, a bittersweet date that Richard had once dreaded, but now faced with courage Emma had helped him find. The event was held at the Callaway estate, transformed into a celebration of life and legacy, filled not with wealthy donors, though they were present, but with families the foundation had already helped. Caregivers who'd been on the brink of homelessness, parents who'd been able to stay with their sick children instead of working 3 jobs, and people who'd found community in their darkest hours. Richard stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and beside him was a large photograph of Sophie, her smile bright and full of life. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady, despite the emotion. "I lost my daughter, and I thought that loss would define the rest of my life. I thought I would just exist, going through motions, building wealth that meant nothing. But then I met someone." He gestured to Emma, who stood to the side, tears streaming down her face. Someone who was experiencing her own devastating loss, and together, in our brokenness, we discovered something profound, that the people we've lost don't want us to stop living. They want us to live better, to love harder, to see the people who are invisible, to stop for the freezing stranger at the bus stop, to choose presence over profit, connection over convenience. He paused, his voice thickening. "Sophie asked me to be kinder, and this foundation is my attempt to honor that request. But it's also more than that. It's a promise to every person here that your sacrifice matters, that caring for your loved ones isn't foolish or financially irresponsible. It's the most important work any human can do, and you shouldn't have to lose everything to do it. So this foundation, it's Sophie's legacy, and it's also Emma's brother Michael's legacy, and it's the legacy of every person who's ever chosen love over everything else." The applause was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. He was looking at Emma, who was mouthing "thank you," and he shook his head, mouthing back, "thank you," because they both understood the truth. They had rescued each other, and in doing so, had found a way to transform their deepest pain into the most beautiful purpose. As spring turned to summer, the guest house that Emma had moved into temporarily became her permanent home, not because she couldn't afford to leave. The foundation paid her well, but because the Callaway estate had become more than a place. It had become a healing ground, a place where grief was honored and hope was cultivated. Richard and Emma fell into a rhythm, working side by side during the day, building the foundation, helping families, creating programs, and in the evenings, they'd sit in the garden that Emma had begun tending, planting flowers in memory of Sophie and Michael, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories, tears, and increasingly, laughter. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Emma said something that had been on her heart for weeks. "Richard, do you think they know? Sophie and Michael, do you think they can see what we're doing? That their deaths weren't meaningless, that something beautiful grew from all that pain?" Richard looked at the garden, blooming with life, then up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'd like to think so. I'd like to believe that Sophie sees me now, finally being the father she needed, even if it's too late for her, and that she's proud. But Emma, even if they can't see it, we can. We see. The families staying together, the children getting more time with their parents, the caregivers who aren't being crushed by financial ruin on top of emotional devastation. And that's real. That matters. That's how love continues beyond death. It flows through us into others. It becomes ripples that spread far beyond what we can see." Emma nodded, a peaceful smile on her face, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied above them. Two broken people who'd been made whole, not by forgetting their losses, but by transforming them into something that would help ensure others didn't suffer alone. A year after that snowy night at the bus stop, Richard hosted a small, private gathering at the estate, just himself, Emma, Mrs. Chen, and a few key foundation staff members. He'd asked them to come to the garden at sunset, and when they arrived, they found something new. Two beautiful memorial benches, positioned side by side, facing the flower garden that had grown lush and vibrant. One bench had a small plaque reading "For Sophie, who taught me to see," and the other read "For Michael, who taught her to give." And between them was a larger stone marker, engraved with the words, "Love doesn't end, it transforms. Sit here and remember them, then stand up and honor them by helping someone who's invisible." Emma gasped when she saw it, her hands covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. And Richard stood beside her, his own eyes wet, but his smile genuine. "I wanted a place," he said softly, "where we could remember them together, where anyone who visits the foundation can sit and reflect, and where we can remind ourselves and others that grief and purpose can coexist, that we can honor the dead while serving the living." Emma couldn't speak. She simply wrapped her arms around Richard, this man who'd been a stranger but had become family, and they stood there as the sun set, surrounded by people who'd become their community, in a garden that had grown from seeds of sorrow into a harvest of hope. That night, as Emma walked back to the guest house, she paused and looked back at the main mansion, its windows glowing warmly, and she thought about that frozen, desperate woman who'd sat at a bus stop, ready to give up, and how a simple act of kindness from a grieving stranger had changed everything. And she whispered into the night, "Thank you, Michael, for every moment we had, and thank you for leading me to someone who understood." And somewhere, in the space between the stars and the earth, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air and everything to do with a love that death couldn't diminish. Richard, watching from his study window, saw Emma pause and smile up at the sky, and he felt Sophie's presence so strongly it took his breath away, and he whispered his own prayer. "I'm trying, sweetheart. Every day I'm trying to be the man you believed I could be, and I hope, wherever you are, you know that you're the reason I finally stopped just existing and started truly living, and that every person we help, every family we save from the isolation and financial ruin that grief can bring, it's because of you. It's all because you loved me enough to ask me to be kinder, and I promise, for the rest of my life, I will honor that request." The story of the millionaire CEO and the freezing nurse became something of an urban legend in the city. Some versions were embellished, others stripped down, but the core remained. A powerful man stopped for a powerless woman, and in that stopping, Both found salvation, not from each other, but through each other, discovering that the antidote to grief isn't forgetting. It's transforming that grief into compassion, that pain into purpose, that loss into legacy, and perhaps most importantly, that the people we love never truly leave us. They live on in every kind choice we make, every hurting person we help, every moment we choose connection over isolation, presence over profit, and love over everything else. Because in the end, love is the only thing that survives, the only thing that matters, the only thing that transforms a frozen night at a bus stop into a lifetime of warmth, purpose, and hope.